Se ci siamo qui, mi dai te un segnale? Ah no, ma tanto mi hanno detto parlare 5 minuti, quindi questo è acceso, vediamo se... Se così si sente?
Sì, si sente.
Direi di sì? Bene, quando... Fabrizio, quando vuoi. All right, I believe that our chair for this afternoon, Fabrizio Tassinari, would like me to begin, and so I will. And it is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here welcoming you. And I have received a very, very pleasant charge to welcome you also on behalf of the co-directors of New York University in Florence, Larry Wolf and Perry Klass. As unfortunately they cannot be with us tonight, they have asked me to bring you their most warm greetings and to express how the academic community of New York University in Florence is truly, truly happy and delighted to host this meeting this evening and to be able to share, at least in part, the very important work of the conference on artificial intelligence and democracy. And in particular, as you know, this afternoon, this end of afternoon, we are here to discuss the book Renovating Democracy, Governing in the Age of Globalization and Digital Capitalism. Later on, our chair will introduce better the participants to this book discussion, to this book presentation. I would like just to perhaps steal a few minutes of your time, very, very briefly, to say why, in my opinion, this is an important book. Why is this an important book? You know, very often we do speak about vicious circles, right? Whilst instead I think, you know, that this book is a very, very good example of what we can call instead a virtuous triangle. Because evidently you will find that in this book there is the experience of at least three kinds of actor, three different kinds of actor. On the one hand, evidently, this is a book that is perfectly up to the standards of academia. By the way, also for those of us who are in the honorable trade of academia, this is also a book that I think, you know, would be an excellent teaching tool. This is indeed, you know, a book that whilst I was reading it, I said, this is something, you know, my students would engage with and would actually like to engage with, and definitely this is an important suggestion. The scholarship, the rigor, the sources, the bibliography that are part of this book, evidently, are up to the standards, the most demanding standards of academia. And this is one edge of the triangle. The second edge of the triangle is also what we have been discussing in the rest of the day, is about the role of that particular sector of civil society that are think tanks. And in fact, you know, if you say think tanks, you imagine a box, and inside this box you have a bunch of people, and what they do all day long is to go mumble, mumble, and they think, you know. When they thought hard enough, then they go back home, and that's it, arrivederci, basta. This is indeed not what think tanks are doing. Because, and this is also very much the theme of the book, in a moment in which the dominating paradigm is not so much government as much as governance, a complex, multi-level, multi-tier function. It is evident that in this world today, knowledge, information, competence are resources as important as mineral oil or gas. Think tanks are supposed to not only possess but actually produce this resource, also because we know that knowledge is one of those common goods that are so important today. And what is special about common goods? What is special about common goods are these kind of goods that the more you share, the more you have. And this is indeed also the role of think tank to grow competence, to grow knowledge, and I also hope very much the dissemination of this competence and this knowledge. And this also brings, let's say, to the third angle of the virtuous triangle, that is policy making, because evidently in this book there is knowledge not only gained in a library. I am the last person to speak about library because this is more or less the only place in which I can be, without creating too much damage to myself and others. But evidently a lot of the knowledge that is in this book has been acquired on the field, in dialogue, cooperation, and exchanges with policymaking at the highest level. So I would say that indeed this book is a great example of a virtuous triangle in which, those different actors, academia, scholars, think tank, civil society, policymakers somehow can exchange, can compare notes and say, in order to do what? Well, and here come to the last, but also the most important reason why I think this is an important book. Also because this book does something that few sources do, that is, actually is trying to give alternatives. Because in fact, you will see that in this book, the authors, and here we are privileged to have one of them with us, which is wonderful, so we can directly engage with you. Actually, you, the authors of this book, you're not solely, conducting an analysis and, talking to us about the glitches and the bumps, etc., which is wonderful, which is fantastic. But you're actually trying your hand at saying, so what? And I would say that actually this book is a very important antidote against the syndrome that we all know too well, that is, the Taina syndrome. There is no alternative. Well, this is a book that is brave, is courageous, does give alternatives. Not necessarily, we can subscribe to everything. I myself, I have a long list of questions that I'm not going to pose, don't worry. But nonetheless, I would really say this. For example, we all know, how overpowering is the role of great transnational corporation, and how slippery and hard to control is this kind of, post-industrial capitalism that we live in. Well, in this book, you do find also very brave hypotheses, solutions. Let's think of a post-capitalism. Perhaps, I don't know whether I would subscribe every inch of your way to post-capitalism, but bless your heart, at least you put something on the table, a concrete alternative that we can start to discuss. As well as, and this is going to be my last remark, I also think that in this book there is another very, very important element that is also the need to engage also with the daunting task of thinking of, alternative constitutional architectures. That is to say that we all agree that the structures that we have inherited from, the itinerary of modernity are not up to the challenges of our contemporary world. Very well. What can be the alternative? And I would say that one of the very important elements of this book is to combine, on the one hand, evidently, the need for supranational regulatory bodies and some kind also, supranational regulation of the political situation, but also in this book you will also find a great attention to the level of the small, let's say also the level of the local, of city administration, of, the governance that goes on at the very local level, that is the one that is closer, concretely, to the citizens, to men and women of the present world. And so I would say these are just some of the few reasons why I do recommend this book. Last but not least, it is great fun. It just goes down, like water in a hot day. You just drink it. And this is also very important because not necessarily serious scholarship has to be absolutely unpalatable. And instead, this is a very, very captivating book without being stupidly seductive. So thank you very much for giving us, this element for discussion. And now I shall turn the floor to our chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for this introduction, and indeed already getting us into some of the themes of the book. Welcome also from me on behalf of the School of Transnational Governance of the European University Institute, which is one of the co-hosts of the events in the context of which this book presentation takes place, and as well as you can see on the board, the think tank and civil society program of the University of Pennsylvania and the Danish Institute for International Studies. Now, in introducing our author and speaker, I'm tempted to invoke the spirit of Yogi Berra, the legendary catcher of the New York Yankees and author of countless aphorisms. He said, "You can observe a lot just by watching." And I think this goes two ways in this case. I happen to have observed your work for some time and entertained sort of correspondence with you, Nathan, and I'm happy to see that several of the themes about the social contract and deliberative democracy have made their way into the book, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. And of course, on the other hand, the book makes apparent the scope and depths of your observations, which is something that Deborah also hinted at. So I'm really pleased to welcome you here in Fiesole and in Italy. For the benefit of our audience and those that are following on streaming, Nathan Gardels is a senior advisor and co-founder of the Berggruen Institute and a editor-in-chief of the World Post, which is a partnership with the Washington Post. Nathan has a very long and distinguished career in journalism, and he was the editor-in-chief, he still is the editor-in-chief of the New Perspective Quarterly and of the Global Viewpoint Network. Your co-author, Nicholas Berggruen, was supposed to join us today. He may still do later on. We don't know. He has been actually circling. We could prove this. He was circling over Florence, and then the plane took off to Milan. So maybe he's now on his way back from Milan. We will see. I have no further ado other than saying that the title, Renovating Democracy, I was telling you before, if you ever happen to publish an Italian edition of the book, be careful that renovation and everything that concerns buildings, scaffoldings, real estate in Italy has very specific connotations. You know when renovations start, you don't know when they end, you don't know when the construction workers will stop and why they will stop. But we do think that the topic is timely, and therefore I give the floor to you to really give us the context of the book and set out the context for us, so that we can then have a conversation with the panel and with the audience. The floor is yours, Nick.
Thank you both. Just a couple of preliminary comments on the renovation and what it means in Italy. We use the term renovating democracy to make the point that in the age we're moving into, there'll be constant disruption in the digital age. So there'll be constant scaffolding, and there'll be constant renovation. The days of building the building and moving on are probably over in this world. So, but the real meaning of it is to keep the foundation, to keep what's valuable, and to get rid of what's dysfunctional and doesn't work anymore because of changes. That's comment number one. Number two, thank you for your praise. I agree with everything that you said about the book. Meeting here in this wonderful Fiesole and this villa reminds me of something, to paraphrase Thorstein Veblen, who talked about the leisure of the theory class, the theory of the leisure class. This is the leisure of the theory class. So welcome everyone here. So what I'd like to do is just outline the skeletal themes of the book. Obviously in the book we go into great detail, and I'm sure it'll raise a lot of questions, which I know you have questions, or, that's what it's about. I think the point that Deborah made is really one of the ideas of the book is, instead of just analyzing the situation and offering general remedies, we do try to lay out constitutional changes, actual proposed policies, under the belief that if you don't have something concrete as a foil to respond to, you're not really moving the needle. You've got to have something you say, I disagree with that, here's how to amend it, here's how to iterate it, otherwise it doesn't go too far. So the book is a combination of theory and of practice, with some concrete recommendations based in actual practice. So, but let me lay out the main themes of the book and the context. The context that we set is that the rise of populism in the West, the rise of China in the East, and the spread of social media everywhere has prompted a rethinking of democratic systems and how they work or how they don't work. Globalization and digital capitalism have created new classes of winners and losers that the old social contract is not configured to deal with. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So China comes into the picture because China challenges the dysfunctional democracies of the West to get beyond polarization and paralysis and reach a governing consensus by other than illiberal means, or risk falling into second-class status on the world stage. I'm not telling people here anything new, that we have a so-called leader of the free world who relishes battling his way through every 24-hour news cycle by hurling barbed tweets at sundry foes. China's leader, meanwhile, has used his enormous power to chart out a roadmap for the next 30 years on everything from the new Silk Road to artificial intelligence. So that's the challenge in the largest context. Now, in the book, we offer several responses to these challenges. The 3 Ps: participation without populism, predistribution of wealth instead of only redistribution, and positive nationalism. First point, participation without populism. Since social networks have drawn more players into the political fray than ever before, never has a need been greater for the counterbalance of impartial practices and institutions to sort out the cacophony of voices, the welter of conflicting interests, and the deluge of contested information. To mend the breach of distrust between the institutions of self-government and the public, we argue for a new form of citizen engagement, a new kind of citizen engagement we call participation without populism. That essentially means incorporating social networks and more direct democracy into the system through new mediating institutions that complement representative government. I will go through, I guess, later on we can go through what does that mean. Everyone will question what does that actually mean. We can go through citizens' assemblies and so on and so forth. But just to take one example, if such institutions of public deliberation had been in place before the Brexit referendum and all the consequences we now know had been aired, the outcome would have been quite different. Second point, predistribution. The innovations of digital capitalism are steadily disruptive, as I mentioned, and are increasingly divorcing income and employment from productivity growth and wealth creation. So any social contract that responds to this dynamic must protect workers instead of jobs, for example, through universal benefits that are portable among workplaces, and foster an ownership share by all in the wealth generated by the robots that are displacing gainful employment. The aim is to increase or enhance the skills and assets of the less well-off in the first place, predistribution, instead of only redistributing the wealth of others after the fact. We call this universal basic capital. The essential idea is that instead of just breaking up concentration at the top, you want to build wealth and opportunity from below. The best way to fight inequality in the digital age is to spread the equity around. Final point on positive nationalism. In order to harness globalization, we call for dialing back one-size-fits-all hyperglobalization through allowing for, let's call them post-industrial policies that build national economies, and embracing the idea of positive nationalism, which means an allegiance to the values of an inclusive society instead of nationalistic incantation, but tempered by the understanding that open societies require defined borders. I'm sure there's questions about that, and we're happy to have that discussion. On the China point, we have a whole chapter in the book on our meetings in China with Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese leadership, and know that situation pretty well. And our argument is that in order to address and temper the mounting tensions between the West and China, there needs to be a partnership of rivals around climate action. Unless there is some area of common intent around the convergent interest, like global warming, all else will dwell in the shadow of distrust and will head into a new Cold War, which we're already headed, and breakup of world into geopolitical blocks and worse. China and the US may well survive the decoupling of their economies from each other, but the world would not survive the decoupling of the climate fates of the two largest carbon emitters on the planet. So, just to recap, participation without populism, predistribution, and positive nationalism. Our argument is unless we follow a path along that course, the West is in danger of positioning itself on the wrong side of history. So this is the general framework of the book, and like I said, we can go into great detail on each one of those if you like, but there's the outline. Thank you.
Thank you. So the way we set it up is we have one main discussant whom I introduce in a second, and then we will open up for questions from the audience. The discussant is sitting here on my right, and is Luca Belgiorno-Nettis. He is a founder of the New Democracy Foundation in Australia, which focuses primarily on political reform. And Luca has also a much longer and distinguished career in management and in investing. Before giving the floor to Luca, I also have a question of my own, which I would like to prompt you with, which is really picking up from something that came up in the news a few days ago, which was this long interview by the FT to Putin. And you know, maybe the material resources that Russia manages to put on the world stage these days are not so massive, but it somehow still manages to hit a nerve when it comes to ideology and normative arguments. And one of the takeaways of that interview is that liberalism is obsolete. That's one of his points, and I guess when he elaborates on that, he mainly refers to multiculturalism and the way we in the West manage multiculturalism. Now, by arguing that for renovation, you are in a sense also saying that there are some things that are obsolete. Right? In fact, if I may quote you, you say that there is something that is valuable and should be saved, but there is also something that is outmoded and dysfunctional and should be discarded. Before giving the floor to Luca, can you say something about what you find dysfunctional and that needs to be discarded? Presumably it's not the same as Mr. Putin, but please. You can take this.
There you go. That's the first time I've been compared to Putin. A couple comments about it. we do have a chapter on the multiculturalism. Let's just take a piece of it instead of, Putin is easy to throw darts at, and obviously I disagree with his statement, but I want to come back to how people are framing the arguments about democracy vis-a-vis China and Russia. I want to come back to that point, but just on the multicultural point. In the book, we do have a chapter called Open Societies Require Defined Borders. And in that section, we start with an interview I did many years ago for the New York Review of Books with Isaiah Berlin, in which he defines cultural pluralism as a defense of belonging of a certain way of life. And I think what we've seen, what we're seeing today is a defense of that, and cultural pluralism has come to mean something different, which is integration of others into that space. And I think this is an area that is very fraught when it's used in a polemical way in political debates, as we're witnessing here in Italy. I don't know how long people have been here. We were talking before between Salvini and the Sea-Watch 3 captain, where there's a demonization of Salvini, of desperation of immigrants, but there's also a demonization of people who want to defend belonging in their society. And in the book we talk about, we quote Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, on reasonable accommodation. We argue that just because you want to defend belonging doesn't mean that you're somehow resurrecting the ghost of Hitler. It means that immigration needs to be aligned with the economic needs and skills of a society. They just can't be wide open. So these are fraught issues, and in that context, I think what Putin was referring to particularly is, the politically correct multiculturalism. This is a favored trope of Trump as well, and this needs to be paid attention to. We cite in the book a guy who's the chair of our philosophy prize. We do a philosophy prize each year, Anthony Appio. He's at New York University, so people probably know him. Wear your identities lightly. He wrote a book called The Lies That Bind. Everyone's a mongrel in some sense, so let's wear our identities lightly and not use them as battering rams in partisan debate. So that's point one on Putin. Second thing on Putin that I would say, and I think it's important, and then I'll get to the question what's broken. So often this debate is cast in, not the way we cast it in the book, is where is democracy not functioning, and where is the dysfunction in our own democratic systems? With Xi Jinping's increasing authoritarian rule, and obviously Putin, the argument has, especially in Washington, has now become democracy versus China and Russia. When in fact, the issue is, the reason you have a Trump to begin with is because of the decay and populism in Europe and in Brazil, is a decay of the institutions of democracy. And the other day I was giving a talk at the Chatham House in London, and actually an interview with economists, and they both said the same thing. What's wrong with the system? What's broken? I mean, just you're a cosmopolitan liberal and you don't like the people that got elected. What's the problem? The problem is not voting. The problem is not elections. The problem is the other part of democracy, which is as essential as voting, is what happens outside the ballot box. It's the operational rules, the impartial institutions that allow diverse societies to reach consensus and to battle each other in a way that doesn't tear society apart. That's what's broken. That's what's broken in Brazil. That's what's broken in Italy. That's the demonization I was talking about before. It's broken in most democracies. So we try to focus, and that gets to the deliberative institutions and the practices of how you come to consensus and how you include everyone in society, as opposed to elections. Elections are only an expression of the deeper turmoil underneath. They don't really decide anything in the end, and they're not going to be able to decide anything without these other institutions being repaired.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio, Deborah, Nathan, actually, for also even accommodating me to have this critique, if you like. It's not going to really be much of a critique in the sense that I'm a great admirer of Nathan and Nicholas's work. And I wanted to just briefly give a sense, because really we need to get into the detail of what they are proposing in the book to get a reaction. All that sounds great, and it is great, actually, what I really believe what Nathan and our other two participants have said about the book. So I start by saying the book is a compendium of 3 governance issues that the Berggruen Institute has tackled over the last 5 to 10 years. Those 3 initiatives have each been given their own chapter, and Nathan has described them as participation without populism, redistribution of wealth, and positive nationalism. They actually come with different titles in the book. The positive nationalism is titled Harnessing Globalization, and it includes the whole discussion around China. The redistribution of wealth is the future of work and capitalism, and the participation without populism is titled Rethinking Democracy, and it's really about how they are looking to reframe the California legislature. So, and I can spend a lot of time talking about each of the 3, but I wanted to spend time on the last, which is kind of where my favourite subject is. It's my hobby horse, which is the Rethinking Democracy, and it's the detail of how Nathan and Nicholas actually look to reframe the California legislature. So most of us here, we've just heard about the issues around politics generally. There's an extraordinary level of turmoil just about everywhere. How much turmoil and what it's due to is open to conjecture. The authors live in California, and as in most of the US, there is quite a bit of tossing and turning there. In their words, polarisation, partisan gridlock, and we know these terms have sharply divided, these were their words, have sharply divided the country, disabling the capacity to achieve a governing consensus and paralysing government. So through their Think Long Committee for California, they've worked hard to unearth the sources of this turmoil. And this Think Long Committee is made up of eminent Californians, just as in fact their discussions that they've had in China has been done with a so-called, they've labelled it the 21st Century Council. And just to understand what we're dealing with here, their 21st Century Council has got a number of Nobel laureates on it, some 16 former heads of state, tech titans from Google, Twitter, Snapchat, LinkedIn and Alibaba amongst others. So we're talking about some serious players here who've got some serious thinking of their own to contribute to this exercise. And similarly in California, they've got retired judges, tech titans and the like. So this Think Long Committee has proposed a solution. It's a mixed constitution. This is a little bit esoteric, but then I'm going to get into the detail. That encourages participation but not populism. What does that mean, and how does that translate in practice? Right, so a good part of the chapter is devoted to the issue of the Citizen Ballot Initiative. So as most of you are probably aware of, that's been a really fraught question in California. It's ended up with some very problematic outcomes. For example, their words again, Proposition 13, which is the famous 1978 anti-tax measure that severely limited property tax and set off a cascade of misguided policies. It led to other propositions over succeeding years to compete and compensate for the dearth of funds. So that was clearly something that needed to be addressed, that Citizen Ballot Initiative. But underneath all of this, they're inspired by the writings, and this is where, as Deborah says, this is a serious book for academia, because there's so many great sources that they rely on here, including the US Founding Fathers, the writings of John Calhoun, and the contributions of the progressive state governors such as Robert Lafayette from Wisconsin. The authors regard California as a potential laboratory of democracy. They see the need to introduce, in their words, a deliberative ballast to the popularly elected state assemblies and the various ballot initiatives. So what they're proposing is a new, in their words, new non-partisan appointed Senate comprising of eminent men and women of experience and expertise. But they're also proposing a newly configured state assembly. The state assembly, and to the point that Deborah makes, would be no longer directly elected. Popular elections would only occur at the neighbourhood level, comprising about 50,000 voters. 6 delegates, each elected by their respective neighbourhoods of 50,000, would then, in their turn, band together to select one representative for the State Assembly. Now, you know, I can do the numbers here, that'll bore you, but just to give you a sense, with a voting population of about, 30-odd million, 35 million, the new Assembly would have 120 representatives, which is the current mix of lower house and Senate now in California makes up 120. Now, they see this system as closing the distance between the representatives, so you're getting only the voters directly voting at the neighbourhood level. 50,000 voters voting for one representative in their neighbourhood, and then those representatives in their turn select they band together and they select in groups of 6 to select for the Assembly. Then the new Senate would only have 25 members with 8-year terms and appointed as follows. 10, and I have no understanding of the California legislative. I mean, I didn't even know what the counties do in California, but now I do, you know. So, a little bit at least anyway. So, there would be, of the 25 members in the new Senate, 10 would be selected by the counties. I won't go into the detail of that. 6 senators would be selected by the State Assembly, 6 by the State Governor, and 3 by California's 3 higher education institutions, University of California, California State University, and the community colleges. So you've got this hopefully non-populist Senate group that is made up of hopefully eminent and expert players. So I'll just say one further thing about the Senate and then I'll close and then we can open it up for further discussion. The newly configured Senate would also solicit views from the public about concerns that are not being adequately addressed by the State Assembly, and at the same time the Senate would also have oversight on any of the ballot initiatives. So you would no longer have a ballot initiative that would simply come up and take its course if it got the requisite number of signatures. No, the Senate, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, the Senate would review that initiative. If it thought it was worthy of going forward, they would endorse it with either a recommendation, an advisory recommendation of their own, in their own words, but they'd leave it for the electorate finally to be the final arbiter. So if they thought a ballot initiative was worthy of going forward, they would let it go forward, but it would go with their recommendations, either a pro or a con in respect of that initiative. So I thought these are sort of interesting things, and we can talk about the value of those.
Thank you.
Can I put some of that in context? I'm sure it's confused everybody, especially Jane, who's Congresswoman here, former Congresswoman. Let me put that in context. First of all, about California in general in the book, we're not proposing California as a model. This idea that we've spun out is intended as a way to think about the design of democratic institutions and the various relationships between participation, representation, and decision-making. So this model we lay out is following through on our thinking. But let me set the context. Why even talk about this? The reason is that, and often when I give these talks, people say, well, you're promoting direct democracy, that's a disaster. That gives the majority power. They will pass things against immigrants, about same-sex marriage, all things which California did. The starting point of this experience is California is already a direct democracy. California, since 1914, we've had the initiative process. And we do have a governor and we do have a legislature, but all the consequential decisions of the state Budget, taxes, environment were all made at the ballot box by the citizens. So I was at a forum last year here in Rome with the Five-Star Movement was engaged. And they've just appointed in Italy a new minister for direct democracy so that they had this kind of initiative process in California. The initiative process, direct democracy, means citizens sign petitions or gather signatures, they get qualified, they go to the ballot. Italy wants to do that now. So I was at this forum last year, and all of those who didn't have direct democracy were all the marginal groups that want a voice. Those of us who have direct democracy, wait a minute, let's figure out how to deliberate, how to filter direct democracy in order to have good governance. So that's the starting point of this book, because in California until 2014, if 365,000, the signatures are based upon the number of voters in the previous gubernatorial election, if 365,000 people sign a petition to ban same-sex marriage, or to stop benefits for immigrants, or it goes to the ballot, and if people vote for it, it becomes a law. This happened in California already. They were thrown out by the courts because it's not What?
I think you're forgetting that the courts can review those decisions and they have turned them down repeatedly.
I just said that. I just said that.
I voted 3 times to legalize marijuana, and it got taken down. So this is not an unbiased view of direct democracy.
Let me.
Many of the decisions are reversed either at the state or
Let me just finish my point. I actually said that. I said they were thrown out by the courts. Similarly, now I forgot my train of thought. So similarly, you mentioned the tax thing. The problem with direct democracy on taxation, use the example of Prop 13. And I won't go into details, but basically a limited property tax which funded schools and localities. In response to that, there were a number of cascading consequences over the years. The teachers voted to make sure that by ballot initiative, that 40% of all the budget goes to the teachers, goes to the K through 12 schools. Then others fought for their share of the pie, like the various unions and the pensions and so on. The point is you got a series of cascading consequences because the direct democracy was not mediated or deliberated. So the point here is there is second reading of legislation between the Assembly and the Senate. If you propose legislation in the Assembly, it's read by the Senate. What are the unintended consequences? What are the problems that you didn't fix, et cetera, et cetera. There's a second reading. There isn't such a thing with a citizen ballot initiative. If you sign the signatures, it goes to the ballot and people vote on it. That was until 2014. 2014, we passed a law which said that when 25% of the signatures are gathered, there needs to be public hearings, and the legislature has the opportunity to negotiate with sponsors to fix the problem through legislation, and if you can, compromise and withdraw the ballot and go to the legislature. If not, the ballot initiative goes on to the public. This has resulted so far in landmark minimum wage legislation and in the first Data Privacy Act in the United States. Both were initiatives, in the case of minimum wage, by labor unions, and the second one was privacy activists that brought Silicon Valley to the table. Both were negotiated in the legislature and came out with legislation and compromise for those two laws. So the point is, to go back to all this, the point is there needs to be a second reading of citizens' ballot initiatives in order to make sound policy and to liberate choices. This goes back to the mediating institutions I said before that complement representative government. Now, I'm not sure what your point is about the courts. The courts have thrown out a lot of things because they're not constitutional. That's, some things are just not constitutional, Human rights are not constitutional. Are constitutional. You can't override them with a ballot initiative. But unlike Britain, the other day someone said, who's sovereign Britain? There's the Brexit that people voted, and then there's the parliament. And there's no written constitution, so someone said, well, who's making the decisions here? In California, it's crystal clear. The referendum makes the citizens make the decision. You cannot overturn a referendum except by another referendum. So we're trying to fix that. That's the issue. It's not direct democracy is a great idea, although it's a wave of the future because of this power of social media. But that's where this whole thing started.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. I was actually tempted to say we should cover California, but I think now we did. There's, of course, there can be certainly more interventions on this. Deborah had some direct questions as well, and then we open up for the audience.
No? This one works? All right. So Fabrizio wanted me to ask direct questions. It looks as though I have a tradition of asking direct questions. So here we go. The first one is actually on that very interesting part of your book. It's about the post-capitalist scenario. In particular, I refer to page 111. Ultimately, one can imagine a post-capitalist scenario that would involve completely overhauling corporate ownership. Suppose every sizable company in the economy were required to parcel its equity into thirds, 1/3 to private investors, 1/3 owned by the employees, 1/3 to be owned by the public at large in a kind of universal investment funds. And here, of course, I cannot read too much, but essentially this is your idea of not of a redistribution, but a pre-distribution. So I would say you hit the center. Why? Because one of the is working. Yeah, yes. Yeah. Evidently, one of the big reasons why the old social contract doesn't work anymore is that work, paid work, is no longer the passport for social rights, is no longer the passport for citizenship, and governments cannot any longer count on the possibility of using fiscal pressure to redistribute. So the divorce between work and redistribution is a fact. Question. However, I think, somehow, if you think of some kind of, democratized democratizing corporation, at any rate, the logic that is typical of a corporation is not the same logic of a political body. Meaning, I might very well, as a citizen, receive a share of a corporation, but my role debating the destiny of those shares will not be the same role that I have as a citizen debating the destiny of my country, because it's a different logic. So I would say, what would you say to that? The second point is, in fact, on the Constitution proposal. I can very well see, the need somehow to isolate some parts of the liberation from what can look like direct democracy. A footnote. I don't think that Italy is a good idea. It's not a good example of direct democracy. Why? It's not a good example of direct democracy, let's say, the five-star movement in Italy, because, you don't do serious direct democracy out of a platform that is privately owned. I mean, you can call it Rousseau as much as you want, but that's a private property and there's nothing to do with direct democracy. Also because the point is how to reorganize, how to sustain a creation of a public will that goes beyond the simple counting of votes. If in these efforts, for example, here, I'm sure that you were also very interested, by the role of universities and in general, about the role of, let's say, the world of science that you give in all this. So here I have to ask a direct question. Don't you think that this design looks a lot like contemporary EU governance? But in contemporary EU governance, what you got a major divorce between a technocratic level and a public sphere that it's only consulting and never deciding. So isn't it going through the same path? In your work, have you considered the example of European Union governance? Because surely this could be important for your project. Last but not least, I can see that you try to achieve a non-partisan politics. On the other hand, politics have to be partisan, because politics are about taking part. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of those who are on the top, or are you on the side of those who are on the bottom? I can very well also, as Jane, you were saying this morning, I understand very well what you mean by non-partisan politics. But if we do not have a minimum, and here I'm going to say a bad word, a minimum also of ideological differences, politics becomes only administration.
Wow, all right.
Okay, let me start at the last and go backward as far as I remember all the points. So No, it's not technocracy. As I was just explaining, the point is if you have direct democracy and people have a direct voice in making laws and policies, there needs to be a second reading of those laws to understand the complexities, the unintended consequences, et cetera, et cetera. In the way that we're discussing it, that is not the end point. Some technocratic body does not make the decision. They make the deliberation. The decision has to go back to either to the elected representatives or go back to the public in a ballot measure. The point is, raw emotion should not go to the ballot. Raw emotion should be filtered through reason, and that should go back to the ballot. So it's not a technocratic. In fact, we have a long section on the Founding Fathers and going through the Progressive era. The Founding Fathers of the United States emphasized deliberation and indirect institutions. Supreme Court, independent indirect institution, Supreme Court, indirectly elected Senate, so on and so forth, to stand between power and the people. 100 years later, the progressive movement in the United States proposed direct democracy and smart government, meaning that people should vote at the ballot box, but that cities should be run by professional managers and utilities should be regulated by authorities, not by cronies. So what we try to do in the book is say it's a third term. We want to combine both of the deliberation and the direct democracy and the smart government. And so the balance you want is between those with knowledge and those with experience that filter public concerns in a way that can be presented to the public ultimately as the sovereign in the case of direct democracy. So that's number one. Number two, let me just answer all the predistribution issue. The point of predistribution is just as you said, and what I said in my opening comments. This has to be addressed because digital capitalism is separating employment and income from productivity growth and wealth creation. The model of the social contract in the welfare state was, or in the post-war period, was that wages were linked to productivity growth on the one hand. On the other hand, you had high progressive taxation that cut down the top. That was the model, okay? If wages are not linked to productivity, but robots are in charge of productivity, you've got to deal with that issue. So predistribution is about that. Now, how do you do it? There's a menu of innovations that are possible. It can range anywhere from mutual funds, mandated savings and mutual funds which all invest in these companies and therefore get a return on capital. Return on capital should supplement wages and salaries. You can't rely on wages and salary alone. You could have platform cooperatives. For example, there's a company in Massachusetts where you share your medical data, and in return for that, you get a piece of any royalty. You get a royalty from any innovation that went to the market. There are also ideas that have been proposed where, say, like Uber or Lyft or ride-sharing services, instead of being owned by a private company, they can be owned by a neighborhood or a community in which they all own a fractional share, which is registered and they're paid through a blockchain system. There's data dividends. In California, our Governor Newsom has, after reading the book, actually has proposed that everyone should get a data dividend for their data being used by private companies and making a profit from it. So the number of ways in which predistribution can work. I'm not sure what the ultimate solution is. It depends on your political culture. It depends on the legal system. It depends on many things. But the basic idea is that. But the other aspect I didn't mention, just to mention about predistribution, is the importance of public higher education. We also argue that public higher education should be the floor the way secondary schooling was in the industrial age. And that needs to be financed properly probably by progressive taxation. And it's important to the shifting skills that take place. So you want to create skills and assets for the less well-off. So that's the predistribution idea. And the final question I think you ask is kind of what role do shareholders have in a predistribution scheme? I think that's an open question. Among our two authors here, I'm the one that's not a billionaire. The billionaire is the one who's late and not here because I came by train, he came by plane. That's the problem. Um, but I think that's an open question. Do you want, if the main aim is return on capital, it's not control of the company, that's one decision. If the aim is to be social investing and so on and so forth, like the Norwegian oil dividend fund, they're voting against, for renewable energies, against oil exploration and so on. I think those are open questions, but the principle of predistribution is people need to get a return on capital from the robots by investing in the robots that are generating the wealth, because it's going to put people out of work and they won't be able to make a living. That's like the fundamental concept.
All right, I also would have some questions, but I think now we open up the floor if there are questions from the audience. So Jane, if you could. Yeah.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Nathan. Somehow I got dropped from your weekly world list. I need to be on it. How will I have any ideas if I don't get that weekly thing? Like some here, I'm lucky enough to be a citizen of California and to have grown up there. It's a marvelous place. And some initiative measures are helpful, even pre-2014, one of which, and I just want to put this out there, and these two passed. One decided that citizen commissions would draw the lines for congressional districts instead of political groups or a political governor elected by one party. And the other one said that, again, in running for federal office, it may apply to state office, but I don't know, all the candidates run in one primary called a jungle primary. Why are these good reforms? Because they reduce the amount of politics in creating congressional districts, and they also guarantee that those running for political office actually have to talk to members of the other party. And so they reduce what I would say is the real dysfunctional, exaggerated impact of very partisan primaries. This is at the federal level, not the state level, and those are good reforms. I was proud to vote for them. Both political parties opposed them, just to make a point. But my question is this. We were discussing this morning about, and I think it's true certainly in Europe and the US, the decline of the center in politics. And it's certainly true in Congress. There's virtually no center, the US Congress. And it's true in the parliamentary elections to the EU that just happened. The center lost, and parties on both the left and the right won, as a generalization. My question is, how do you think about this? And this is an audience of think tanks, an international audience of some really impressive folks. What role can think tanks play in being mediating institutions? Because if there's no center, there's very little hope that we could mediate anything.
Yeah, thank you. In the book, my presentation was short, but in the book we do go through there are good things when citizens and civil society get together, it really matters positively for direct democracy. You mentioned the top two primary, you mentioned the citizens drawing districts instead of legislatures. There's also protection of the coast, which came by an initiative, and so on. So to mention civil society, this is very interesting. In our Think Long committee, when we did the reform on initiatives in 2014, the deliberative aspect of it was funded by the foundations, by the think tanks, Hewlett and those foundations. They wouldn't be directly engaged in politics because that's against the nonprofit rules, but they were the forum, the platform for discussion, how to design these things and so on and so forth. So I think that's an important role that think tanks can play. I think also, well, to go to the point about the center, I think it's important that Luca is here on this. What I said before is what's broken is what's outside the ballot box, the operational constraints and the institutions that allow deliberations. Politics is never going to be nonpartisan. That's not what we're arguing. We're arguing the platforms in which partisan decisions are made need to be depoliticized and impartial so that people trust them. And I think that's what's broken down. So to give an example of something that Luca is involved in on very controversial issues in reaching the center, or these one way of deliberation. We talked about a Senate in California, but another way are these citizens' assemblies or citizen juries in which, like a jury in a trial, you bring together the prosecution and the defense and the experts, and they present the evidence, and the jury makes a decision. There's a similar thing. We have juries for murder trials, but we don't have juries for the suicide of republics. One of the things that citizen assemblies does, a good example is Ireland. So you can't think of a more controversial issue than abortion in Ireland. Should it be in the Constitution? Should it be outlawed? Some people that Luca is associated with in Ireland, David Farrell, and in the parliament got together and said, let's have a citizens' assembly. Citizens' assembly is a random sampling that represents the whole society, indicative of the whole society, brought together with experts, presented with evidence, and they discussed the abortion issue. The issue was, it's Section 8 of the Constitution. Should it be in the Constitution outlawing abortion, or should it not be in the Constitution? It wasn't whether are you favor abortion or against abortion, but it should be outlawed. That very highly controversial issue, they came together, they met for 6 months, they had these discussions. Their deliberations were noted in the public referendum, and people voted to remove it from the Constitution. So you brought two sides together on a highly partisan issue, highly emotional issue. They were able to come to consensus. Another example was over migrants in a place called Wigham's in London, in Great Britain, where, as was happening in Italy, some immigrants came, rescued refugees, and were just, as part of their apportionment, they got sent to this town in Great Britain, 300 people. There was an immediate uproar in the town, which is understandable. It's a small town, and all of a sudden 300 people from Africa show up. And Syria, I guess it was the Syrians and Africans. But when they got together and they discussed, who are these immigrants, how long are they going to stay, what are the benefits they're going to have, et cetera, the town agreed. And they agreed to have the immigrants stay there. I forget what the period was, but it was a compromise between kicking them out and having them, live there for the next 20 years. The point being, these kind of mediating citizen assembly type things, which are taken out of, when we say nonpartisan, they're taken out of political parties vying for power. That's what poisons the system. They're playing to the media, they're playing to their constituencies like Trump. When you take an issue out of that and have citizens themselves making decisions when presented with evidence, it's shown time and time again that this can create a consensus and an inclusiveness and a consensus. What's broken is people weren't included, and what's broken is mechanisms to reach consensus. So I think we discuss that in the book. Again, the California is not a model, it's a way to think about these things, because we already have direct democracy. And on the 5-star movement, I agree, they're not democratic per se, but their slogan is participate, don't delegate. They arose because it was a revolt, part of a revolt against the corruption of the political class. So it's an expression, and their demand, like the Yellow Jackets in France, is for direct democracy. So what we're trying to point to is the frustration with corruption and a moribund political class leads both to populism of Salvini types, but also to looking for new mechanisms for participation and inclusion. And I think that wave has to be responded to, because it's fortified by the participatory power of social media.
Okay, there's Nicole, and then Miguel. We take 2 questions at a time because there are a few others.
So I have a quick question for you. Great piece in terms of discussion. I can't wait to read the book. I'm at Brookings in Washington, D.C., Nicole Turner-Lee. So 2 questions. One on this whole idea of California in terms of exercising these rights and instituting these laws. So I'm right now involved with the federal privacy legislation conversation. California has moved ahead of the U.S. government with regards to federal privacy and is presenting a big preemption problem right now. The extent to which we'll have disparate and fragmented privacy policies throughout the United States, the extent to which California has, and the government has placed some guardrails and safeguards that's just going to throw off the establishment of unified policy, or if other states will take the lead. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on when there are issues that require some level of uniformity and harmonization of laws, the extent to which we should be looking at, broader models as opposed to empowering states under this new democracy to take on, these positions on themselves. The other question I had for you, part two, is this whole idea of, and you mentioned it specifically with digital dividends, so I'll use that as an example. While these models may promote inclusivity, what is the extent to which they reduce inequality? So if you take the idea of what California is doing with digital dividends, the scary part about it is our poor people who will commoditize their data because they have no other choice and can be exploited in the marketplace. So I'm curious, under the model that you're proposing, the extent to which these inclusive systems will actually render better results towards reducing inequality versus creating more tribalism among, groups that tend to be more engaged than others, or may see some of these policies as ways to, again, I think of the digital, we just had this conversation, say, oh, I'll sell my data for 50 cents because I need to eat, not necessarily because I feel the complete ownership. So, again, that goes a lot with consumer confusion around, civic inclusion.
Thank you. I was not supposed to ask a question, but since I live in California and I'm a European, I want to give a European perspective over California. So I think these issues are very interesting. I'm not an expert on the field of democracy as a scholar, but I was living in California and I noticed one thing that perhaps was not mentioned here, is that a big part of the workforce of California doesn't have the right to vote, doesn't have the right to have other rights that usually citizen has, and that might be an issue in the long term. And I think one of the reasons that it happens is because of the gridlock that is in Washington about the whole immigration, reform, and that could have consequences for not just for California but also for the U.S. as a democracy. So I would like for you to give an input about this comment and question.
Just to clarify, you're saying undocumented immigrants don't have the right to vote. That's what you're saying?
Yes. Well, there are two kinds of, I think, there are illegal immigrants and also legal immigrants that don't have the right to vote.
Yeah. Let me try to remember all those, but I wanted to actually say something after what Jane said about the citizens redistricting, since it's a conference about AI and democracy, and thinking forward. The citizens redistricting got rid of gerrymandering. It brought the citizens in to draw the electoral districts instead of partisan legislatures, which is a good thing. But it's an enormously convoluted and complex process. And one of the discussions I was having recently here elsewhere in Italy is, and this was suggested on our Think Long committee by Eric Schmidt from, used to be with Google, the district should be drawn by algorithm, which has more access to data than anyone else does, and there's a controversial point. Now, secondly, on data dividend, again, let me say the same thing I said about predistribution. There are a lot of issues in all of this. Who's in, who's out? Who gets the vote if you're corporate, if you own shares, or who doesn't? There's a lot of issues. The principle is, if your data is being used by these big companies to make their profits, you are their product. You should share in something. Now, it's a legitimate issue about do you want data to be commodified or not? You can go the other way and say, let's re-decentralize the internet, and so it's not. No, is this better? It's a small room. I think those are valid issues. You should take away from big companies. It's a discussion over whether you should break up antitrust, the argument now about Facebook and Google, should they be broken up? Some argue, no, they should be regulated. You want the network effect. You don't want to break up the network effect. What you'll get is a bunch of mini Facebooks with even more fake news and more alternative facts, et cetera. So I think those are all valid issues. In terms of California's data privacy, we've also, just a law went into effect in July that requires identifying bots it doesn't outlaw them. For example, when there's an earthquake, bots go out all over the place. But political bots, we want to know who's shaping the debate. So there's a law on that too. I'm not sure your question. The California experience, Jane can say more about this than I probably. The California experience is what we do first in auto emissions, in energy efficiency, et cetera, tends to go back to the rest of the country. It doesn't come from Washington and come west. And the same thing is true of data privacy. And the same thing is true, by the way, of climate change. We have a project of integrating carbon trading markets with China, even though Trump has pulled out. So I think you've got to start things where it's possible to do it. Washington is impossibly tied up in gridlock. And one of the points that you make in the book is all institutional innovations in American history have come from the states. What the Founding Fathers experienced in the states between independence and the Constitution in 1789, where doing constitutions and figuring out what to do. The progressive movement was all in the states. They were the first to do not minimum wage laws, but working hour laws, women's vote. They came from the states and went to the national level. So same thing is true with GDPR. But the other thing is true of GDPR is now California's GDPR, or its data privacy, is compatible. It's what do you call it? Information compatible with European GDPR. So there's not issues of, as it is with Japan. So there's not issues of protectionism along.
Well, and I only bring it up, and I'm sorry, I don't want to hog it, but I bring it up. I have take some divergence from your comments, given the fact that data privacy and online privacy is a little different in terms of digital capitalism, right? Because you're talking about portability of information and how if we did have a fragmented policies among the 50 states like we have with data breach policies, we may not have harmonized rules that land up with a clear set of standards for how you actually implement data privacy. So I do agree with you on the other areas, because I'm from New York. New York has been very involved with trying to be first, but California always beats us. But I would suggest that in areas where we see more portability of information, particularly in the digital economy, it becomes more difficult when states actually take action before federal. And that's what we learned from GDPR, and that's what I think Congress is learning from the California Data Protection Act, which is either you come up with something in urgency or you don't, or you let California lead, and then you have to deal with 49 other places that are going to have different data protection. So it's just interesting because it's a different type of commodity that we're looking at, which has implications on where you live and is more portable than what we've seen in other instances. So I think it's an interesting concept and framework. It's just something that we continue to think about in Washington as policymakers. Who sets the standard? Is it a federalist policy or is it a statewide policy?
Okay.
That's what think tanks are for.
All right. The gentleman there has been waiting for a long time. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I like the cover of the book. So my reading is that you want to emphasize that democracy is always under construction, something like that. And I think you're right. So, and I can easily, I haven't read it yet, but I will. And I can easily buy the two first P's in your kind of proposed solution. I have more trouble with the third one. And I was, quickly looking at the book now while you were talking. And, when you say that open societies need defined borders, I'm not sure about what you mean by that, and it's actually a clarificatory question, right? So I tend to believe, and actually you concede that at the beginning of the chapter, that the future of the world will be, again, this is an idea that you repeat several times, there is no solution that fits all cases and all needs, right? And so we will see a variety of forms of governance and so on. And I tend to sympathize with that, but I think that the conclusions that you draw from this starting idea doesn't follow, actually. So because your solution is nationalize the world to some extent, right? Positive nationalism is about nations, right? And that's the part I don't see. I think that, our countries are more and more diverse. I think they will be even more diverse in the future. And they will look like many of our cities today, the global cities. that many people think that they are like the rising global actors that might have a crucial role in global governance. This has nothing to do with nations, right? It has to do with a different idea of democracy. So what I don't really see is why we need to preserve national democracy. That's the direct version of the question. Thank you.
Should I answer that one?
Sure.
Yeah. In the book, we say, elites like to think global, but people react local. I see your vision, and in fact, in a previous book, talked about the global cities and a network of global cities. I think the reality of the populist movement of the past few years is a nation state remains the container of legitimacy for now. And in the book, we quote Bill Clinton saying, positive nationalism is not the alternative to globalization, it's the precondition for it, for global cooperation. It's a precondition for it. And that's really what we're trying to get at, that you've got to take care of your publics, and on that basis cooperate. So as we all understand, there's many dimensions. In fact, in the book we go back and forth in debate with Gordon Brown, and then people follow Danny Roderick on this question. Where Danny Roderick says, let's roll back hyperglobalization, like I mentioned, and Gordon Brown says also correctly, there's certain things a nation state obviously can't do. You know, climate change, financial flows, et cetera, et cetera. That's all true. But what we're trying to do is distinguish, what the national state can do, since it is the basis of legitimacy for democracies. We might like to think that's true in the future, and my own view is how to work out networks and legitimacy is an important question. But for now, you have Salvini as the Interior Minister of Italy. Okay, so you've got to deal with that. On the question of positive nationalism, though, and immigration, the point we try to make is that cultures and societies are open. Influences come, people change, things transform, but often they don't balance out. It takes a long time for things to balance out, but in any case, they're open systems. But nation states are not open systems. Nation states are a jurisdiction with a fiscal reality, a tax base, a welfare system. Now, you have to take that into account when Fabrizio is the expert on this. You have to take that account when immigrants come into a system. What made the Scandinavian systems work is with a watertight social contract. Everyone has to believe that the burdens and benefits of a social contract are fair. When new players come into the game, it changes the situation. So you've got to think, and when you're thinking of immigration and you're thinking of positive nationalism, you want inclusive values, but you have to have fiscal realities, and you have to think of immigration as what it means to your economy and to your welfare arrangement. So, for example, Canada is often held up as the great example of a liberal state that does great integration of immigrants. We talk in the book with Justin Trudeau about this. It's true, they took 25,000 refugees from the Syrian civil war. But Canada has a meritocratic system of immigration entry. In the United States, 60% of people enter the United States, and I think this is true of Italy too, I'm not sure, enter the United States, come in the family basket, so to speak, like my mother's here, or my husband's here, or my kid's here, something like that. And only 20% or more, or around there, come from what they call the economic basket, which is what are your skills, what are your assets. Canada's just the opposite. 60% come in through the economic class and 20% come in otherwise. Because you've got to manage your society. So all we're saying in that open societies don't work, and social contracts in open societies don't work, unless there's a fair sharing of the burden and a perception of a fair sharing of burden and benefits. And that just can't be ignored. It has to be realized. This is the final point, so you don't misinterpret me. So what does that mean in the United States? I mean, does it mean that Trump is proposing a meritocratic approach like China and like Australia? I personally don't disagree with that in principle. But there are other aspects which, of course, he doesn't deal with. which is the DACA students that were born in the United States, or that were born but their parents weren't legal, that they should stay in the United States. There's a path to citizenship for those who've been in the United States a long time. He doesn't include that. One of the members of our group, the former Mexican president Ernesto Zedillo, argues a work permit program, where you can go back and forth across the Mexican border. California needs that labor. It fits with the economy. And most immigrants, in my experience, would like to live in Mexico, not just the United States, or at least to go back easy with their family, and work permits. So you need all those elements together. But I do think you have to recognize that states are fiscal jurisdictions where burdens and benefits need to be shared. And how immigrants fit into that is a big issue.
Thank you. I would actually submit that winning a World Cup in soccer is a great example of positive nationalism, so you can tell us something about that too. Yeah. Miguel Maduro had a question as well. And the gentleman first and then Miguel.
Well, first, I want to apologize for not having read the book. And I've only been able to form an impression of its gist from what you were saying. And the central theme I come up with is the entire effort is an attempt to get rid of political parties. And not just political parties, but other forms of citizen representation such as trade unions and other, and to replace them with some sort of combination of what Robert Dahl once called guardian institutions of various kinds, plus think tanks. So making democracy run by think tanks. Now, my big question is, why is it that citizens, ordinary citizens, not think tank participants or people with PhDs or whatever it is, and even more specifically, people from ethnic and religious minorities who may not be very well represented in the think tank universe, why do they regard this monitoring function, this that you're granting to these people, why should they regard those as legitimate? And why is it, you seem to be assuming that if you put together a bunch of experts, they'll somehow agree with each other in some nonpartisan fashion. I don't believe that is likely. I believe that if you, this kind of a system, you would end up with a think tank for this particular orientation and another one. Why would I expect a think tank or a bunch of experts or a guardian institution like some executive committee, or for that matter, judges of various kinds, why should I regard their decisions as legitimate? Because the centerpiece of democratic theory, even among the founding fathers, I might add, and your approach is very, very consistent with the founding fathers. Remember, the founding fathers never used the word democracy. They were founding a republic, not a democracy. Right? And it's very clear that, at least to me, that you're trying to found a republic of experts, of, why would you, because the central principle is missing. The principle is accountability. Getting rid of people who are incompetent, or getting rid, it doesn't, I don't understand where that mechanism would be in this work, because you are offering citizens only alternatives not formed by political parties or by interest groups, but only by responsible people like myself, yourself, us, right? But why, as a citizen, would I regard that as representative? And even more importantly, how confident can I be that I can hold you accountable for what you have decided in this committee of experts, or whatever it is? That seems to me to go to the core of the problem of democracy, as opposed to an enlightened republic, which is what our U.S. founding fathers believed they were putting together.
Thank you.
Should I answer now?
You can answer now, and then we take one more question.
First of all, I'm glad you raised all of those questions, because each one of them is answered in the book, almost in order of the way you put it. We even say in there, democracy is never mentioned in the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, or any of those documents. Yeah. So anyway, but where you're mistaken in what we're proposing, and I go back to the power of participatory media, which has brought more people into the fray than ever before, and the political corollary of that is direct democracy. So that's the reading of reality. Now, therefore, when the public is more participating, I said this before, but let me say it again, and we say it in the book a zillion times. It's not giving power to a technocratic body to make the decisions. It's like the progressives, not the founding fathers, the progressives who brought direct democracy to the United States, through knowledgeable bodies which can work public sentiments into policies. Where's the accountability? That goes back to the elected legislature or to the public at the ballot box to vote for. So, yeah, but technocracy implies the technocrats are making the decisions. Yeah, I keep saying this, but the decision goes to the public. Tell me how we're. Tell me. Oh, okay, well, that's a valid. This is a valid issue to discuss. You know how decisions are made, but don't get the architecture. Don't get the architecture wrong. Now, I want to say about parties and unions. We're not proposing that parties disband, and we're not proposing that unions disband. We're saying it's happening. We're saying the body politic is fragmented. The ability to aggregate collective preferences by big tent parties has disappeared, partly because of social media. I'm not recommending it. I'm saying, how do we deal with it?
There are more parties now than there have ever been in European countries. There are plenty of political parties, maybe.
Right. So what's the difference?
It's not parties that are disappearing. It's the ones in the collusive ones in the center that are disappearing.
What's the difference between, in the Netherlands, they had a vote last year. I think there were 63 parties. What's the difference between 63 parties and none? Almost no difference. You have some parties with like a handful of people. The aggregation, the aggregation of interest and the aggregation of preferences, collective aggregation, is what's broken down by the information revolution. I'm not calling for the end of parties. I think parties are not effective unless you're in China or Japan.
We can continue that conversation afterwards, but I would like to leave Miguel.
I have two questions. The first one is just out of this last comment, and actually poorly impressionistic, so it's not based, and by the way, I've also not read the book, so I'm based on your comments. But I was wondering whether this idea that there's a fragmentation of political parties and that therefore, because they are so fragmented, they will become more irrelevant, it's true, or in fact what we're witnessing is simply a reconfiguration within the party system, but they might continue to be relevant. Because we have, that's why I'm saying this is impressionistic, but we have the example of Greece, the elections 2 days ago, where suddenly you have again a concentration of votes in basically two parties. So the fragmentation that we are witnessing in Europe, suddenly you see to Greece, they went through fragmentation, they had a reconfiguration, and now they have two parties, with one with an absolute majority actually, and the other one a strong opposition party. So the first question is whether you think that you are taking as something that is the final result, what is instead a transition into a new reconfiguration, but still with political parties playing a dominant role and not so fragmented as that. I don't know what is the answer, but is the question. And then the second issue is that what I see, one of the crucial issues, and that has to do with this challenge to intermediation and all that, is the lack of people trust in authority. And not necessarily authority as technocrats or any kind of, but all forms of authority and reference points. And it is on our daily lives. I mean, before we used to listen to what our doctor will tell us, and then we'll accept the diagnosis of the doctor. Now we go on the internet and we second guess what other. So it's on everything, and this is having, I think it's a lot linked with the challenges that we have. What does your book has to say on that?
Last point first. In the book, we talk about peer-driven social media as a game changer for governance and for authority. You know, I keep coming back to this. There seems to be a sense that I'm arguing to smash all these things when I'm saying it's happening. I'm not doing it, you're all doing it. Whoever uses social media, you're doing it. We all suspect authorities. It levels the information playing field between amateurs and professionals. representative democracy, and citizens, the peer-driven social media. That's the reality, and I think that reality is linked to the breakdown of parties. Now, does that mean that a grouping can get together and win an election? Of course it doesn't mean that they can't do that. And in our section of the book discussing this, there's a question mark about political parties. Our suspicion is that the permanent big tent parties, which aggregate large interests as they did during mass industrial society, don't exist anymore. What you have more often now is just-in-time parties. You know, people will vote on this issue or that issue. They'll vote about immigration on one thing, and they'll vote on abortion on another time. So just as you have just-in-time manufacturing, you have just-in-time parties. That's my suspicion. I don't think outside of China or outside of Japan, and where there's one-party rule because there's a cultural grounding for it, I think in the West, the parties are fragmenting as big tent, continuous, permanent institutions. I mean, I don't know what more I need to say than what happened in Europe. Macron, you know, did his own thing without the major parties. Five-Star Movement and Salvini are running things now. The old parties are gone. The big tent parties are gone. It's happening. The fragmentation is happening. It's happening in Brazil. So the evidence seems to be there to me.
So we're running out of time, but there are two more questions. If you can be, please, very brief. Yeah, the two of you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Anne Mettler, and I'm with the European Commission. I want to warmly thank you because I think we are all good at sort of analyzing the phenomenons, but you actually came forward with some concrete proposals. I just want to say I really appreciate it, and I think you deserve a lot of credit for it. Now, what I wanted to say is on this, I never understood you that you don't like parties or you think parties should go away, and you're right that social media was a game changer. And essentially, it empowered the fringes of the political discourse. And I have to say, from where I sit, it just seems to me that democracies are now overwhelmed with all the facts have been replaced by opinions. People want all sorts of things, and we are having a hard time delivering. And I just wanted to, rather than ask a questions, want to tell you how we're dealing with it a little bit at the European level, because I agree with what the professor said before. You should study how the EU does this a little bit, because this coming to a consensus, can you imagine how hard it is in a union of 28? So we have really looked at how do you reach the consensus. And the first thing is subsidiarity. I mean, only the EU is supposed to do what really we should do. And we are even fine-tuning this now to really look at what are the issues that can only be done at the European level and calling them European common goods. Because we understand that when we meddle too much, and intervene too much at the national level, it creates a lot of anxiety and people don't like it. But what I wanted to say in the particular case on globalization, it is seen as an imposition on people. But what we have used our trade agenda to essentially turn that around, because if people feel like they can shape the agenda, they are more engaged. So we have actually made the argument that our trade agenda is a way to export Europe's high standards into the world. And we have used trade agreements to do precisely that. So we have concluded with Japan, and we have an equivalency agreement on data privacy. We have just concluded with Mercosur. Yes, and I have actually made the agreement, the proposal that if we cannot get an agreement with the United States on working more closely with us on these issues, then let's do it with California. It's the 5th largest economy in the world. I believe in this new world we need issue-based alliances, not only between countries, but between various actors. It can also maybe be companies, it can be states, it can be the EU. I don't know, but I think we need to rethink sort of the governance structure.
We call it networks of willing, and networks of the willing in the book.
Very good, excellent. No, but I wanted to say that since we have taken this approach to trade, it's still controversial, but it enjoys a lot more support. So I just want to say, it's very good that you're thinking these issues through, and rather than ask a question, because I know we're out of time, I just wanted to say thank you. I think really well done.
the EU is a great example of output legitimacy. Then when it's in crisis, there is not so much. But
okay, my name is Michael Baumann. I'm a sociologist from Germany. Well, maybe we could just describe the aim of a well-ordered democracy to reach to a kind of reflective equilibrium. So the people is putting some raw ideas, preferences in it, and then we have some actors who are systemizing this, discussing it, and then put it back to the electorate. In the good old times, there were the parties maybe who was able to do this, maybe some other intermediaries, actors. Now the parties are gone for some reason or whatever. So what we do now? So what you propose, as I understand it, I didn't read the book, is a kind of institutionalized body, senate or expert group. And I must say I'm a little bit skeptic about this for reasons the colleague here put forward. Why not face looking at the deliberative process? So to think about how we can create, institutionalize a deliberative process with different tools and means which can substitute this kind of process and reach a reflective equilibrium. Why introducing this new non-legitimized institutions? I didn't understand this.
Okay, good question, because it allowed me to clarify something. The architecture that Luca was describing that we're proposing theoretically for California is to try to institutionalize the process. But why do that? But having said that, there are many ways, just like there are many ways of predistribution, there are many ways of deliberation. Citizens' deliberation, policy juries are citizens, ordinary citizens mixed with Fishkin, etc. It's a way. It doesn't have to be a government institutionalized way that I'm proposing in the upper house. There are many ways to do it, but the point, as you said, is deliberation. Now the problem, you mentioned Fishkin. The problem we're trying to solve, and the problem that citizen assemblies have, or citizen juries, is there's no guarantee of their decision having any impact. It has to be listened to by the elected authorities or whatever. What we're arguing for is this should be integrated into the system so that that deliberation has an impact, that it's linked to referendums and it's linked to votes by legislature. So it's not just citizens out there saying, here's what we think. Because that's not particularly effective. And so it's not a government body. In fact, the idea of the upper house that would be a second reading is composed partly of sortition and partly of appointed officials. The point is that this body should not be in the partisan political fray. That's the main point. So whether it's an upper house, whether it's a citizens' assembly or whatever, that deliberative mechanism is what has to be impartial. That's the only point.
All right. This is an extremely interesting conversation, which I think could continue for a very long time. In fact, the latter part of this discussion, the one from this side of the room, reminded me of a quote that I once saw at the Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. There is this quote by a music critic, I think his name is Albert Murray, and it goes like, "We, meaning the African Americans, invented the blues. Europeans invented psychoanalysis. You invent what you need." Now, I hope this conversation didn't turn into a psychoanalytical, but thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for the discussion.